The text came in the middle of a busy afternoon, just as Julia was helping a customer choose a scarf at her boutique. The cheerful chime of her phone didn't hint at the bombshell waiting inside. She glanced at the screen, expecting a message from a supplier or maybe a friend confirming dinner plans. Instead, her husband's name flashed across the display. She opened it without thinking twice, her mind still half-focused on the customer's indecision over silk versus cashmere. But the words on the screen stopped her heart cold. "I'm leaving you. I've found someone younger, more exciting. I've emptied our joint account. Good luck, Julia." No explanations, no apologies, just a cold, cruel dismissal after 10 years of marriage. Her hands didn't tremble. Her voice remained steady as she advised the customer to go with the cashmere. The only betrayal of emotion was the slight tightening around her eyes. When the customer finally left, Julia locked the door and stood in the middle of her boutique, staring at her phone. She read the message again, as if the words might change on a second glance. But they remained the same, heartless and final. She should have felt devastated, she thought. Should have collapsed into tears, screamed, or at least felt her knees buckle under the weight of betrayal. But she felt nothing. Maybe because, deep down, she'd known this was coming. The late nights at the office that didn't match his pay stubs. The sudden, unexplained business trips. The growing emotional distance, like a chasm widening between them with every passing day. Julia wasn't naive. She just hadn't expected him to be so careless, so cruel in how he ended it. Instead of replying immediately, she placed her phone on the counter and took a deep breath. The boutique, with its soft lighting and racks of carefully curated fashion, felt like a sanctuary. It was her creation, her success, something he'd never truly appreciated or understood. She walked over to the back office, sat down, and opened her laptop. She wasn't going to cry. She was going to plan. Before she even responded to his message, she logged into her separate bank account, the one he didn't know existed, and smiled faintly at the healthy balance there. She had prepared for this. Months ago, when the signs of his infidelity started surfacing, she'd quietly moved her savings, documenting everything. She was many things, but foolish wasn't one of them. After ensuring her finances were secure, she picked up her phone and typed a simple reply, "Good luck." That was it. No anger, no pleading, no emotional breakdown. Just 2 words that carried all the weight of her silent strength. She imagined him reading it, expecting a flood of desperate messages, apologies, maybe even threats. Instead, he'd receive nothing but cold indifference. And that, she knew, would sting more than any outburst. She set her phone down again, leaned back in her chair, and allowed herself the smallest smile. He thought he had won. But the game had just begun. The next morning, Julia woke up not to the sound of her husband's alarm, but to the quiet hum of her own thoughts. The bed felt colder, emptier, but not in a way that hurt. It felt liberating. She made her coffee, fed the cat, Whiskers, who had always preferred her over him anyway, and sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window as the city slowly came to life. Her phone buzzed with another message from him, "Don't bother begging. I've moved on. Melissa makes me feel alive again." Melissa. The name rang hollow in Julia's mind. Probably some 20-something who thought dating an older man was glamorous, not realizing she was just a placeholder until the next thrill came along. Julia didn't respond. Instead, she went to her boutique like it was any other day. She greeted her staff with a smile, reviewed the inventory, and met with a supplier to discuss the upcoming season's trends. No one could tell that her marriage had imploded less than 24 hours ago. That was the thing about Julia, she had mastered the art of grace under pressure long before her husband's betrayal. She built this boutique from scratch, pouring her heart into every detail, while he dismissed it as her little hobby. But this hobby paid the mortgage, funded their vacations, and now served as her fortress. He thought she'd fall apart without him, but the truth was, he had been an accessory in her life, useful at times, but never essential. By lunchtime, her phone had buzzed 3 more times, each message more condescending than the last. "I hope you're not planning to make this difficult. I've already told my family we're over. They agree we drifted apart." Julia rolled her eyes. Of course, he'd frame himself as the victim, painting her as the cold, distant wife. But she didn't care. Let him have his narrative. She had the truth, and more importantly, she had the receipts. Literally. Every suspicious charge, every unexplained withdrawal, every shady transaction was neatly documented and stored. She wasn't just prepared for his betrayal, she was prepared to dismantle him, piece by piece, without breaking a sweat. After closing the boutique for the day, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat down at her desk. She opened the folder labeled Contingency Plan, a collection of documents she'd started compiling months ago. Bank statements, text messages, emails, and even photos. She wasn't a vengeful person by nature, but betrayal had a way of sharpening one's instincts. She forwarded everything to her lawyer, the one she'd quietly consulted after finding the first hotel receipt tucked in his jacket pocket. It was time to put the plan in motion. Her husband thought he'd blindsided her. But Julia had seen the punch coming long before he threw it. And now, it was her turn to hit back. Looking back, Julia realized the signs had been there all along, scattered like breadcrumbs leading to an inevitable conclusion. The late-night business meetings that never added up, the sudden gym obsession after years of couch potato behavior, and the new cologne he claimed was a free sample from work. She remembered the first time she truly felt something was off, a dinner date he'd forgotten they had planned. He came home late, smelling of expensive wine and cheap lies, claiming he'd been caught up with a client. She nodded, smiled, and tucked that moment into the growing file of suspicions in her mind. It wasn't just the lies, it was the shift in energy. The way he stopped asking about her day. How his compliments grew rarer, replaced by passive-aggressive jabs about her appearance, her work, her routines. "You've really let yourself go, Jules," he'd said once, eyeing her yoga pants with disdain. She had laughed it off, but the words stung, not because they were true, but because they revealed who he had become. A man grasping for youth, validation, and excitement in all the wrong places. Meanwhile, Julia had been building a life, a business, and a future, one that no longer included him. The final confirmation came 3 months before the text that ended it all. Julia had found a receipt tucked into the pocket of his favorite blazer, a dinner for 2 at a fancy restaurant on a night he claimed to be working late. She didn't confront him. Not then. Instead, she opened a new bank account the next day, quietly transferring her savings bit by bit. She started documenting everything: phone records, credit card statements, even screenshots of suspicious texts he carelessly left visible. She played the role of the oblivious wife flawlessly, smiling through dinner parties, laughing at his jokes, and pretending she didn't notice the perfume that wasn't hers lingering on his shirts. It was almost comical, really. He thought he was clever, a master of deception. But Julia had been 10 steps ahead, playing a game he didn't even realize existed. She wasn't heartbroken, she was strategic. Every lie he told, every condescending remark, every moment of neglect had been a deposit into her emotional bank account, one she was now ready to cash in. The day he sent that cowardly text, she wasn't devastated. She was relieved. Finally, the charade was over, and she could stop pretending. Now, it was time to show him what happens when you underestimate the woman you vowed to love and cherish. While her husband reveled in the illusion of his grand escape, Julia had already set her secret plan in motion. The day after his final, smug message, she sat quietly in her boutique's back office, reviewing financial documents with a sharp eye for detail. She had always managed their household budget, a fact he took for granted, never realizing how much power that gave her. Months before his betrayal became undeniable, she'd meticulously transferred her savings into a separate account, ensuring he couldn't touch a single cent of her hard-earned money. But this wasn't just about finances, it was about control. He thought he'd blindsided her, but in truth, he was the one walking into a trap. Julia's lawyer, a sharp and discreet woman named Vanessa, had been on standby for weeks. They had prepared every legal document necessary to protect Julia's assets and expose his financial indiscretions. Julia forwarded Vanessa a digital archive of evidence, screenshots of incriminating texts, photos of receipts from luxury hotels and dinners, and detailed spreadsheets tracking every suspicious transaction. Her husband might have emptied their joint account, but that account held nothing more than a decoy, just enough funds to keep him from realizing she'd secured the real money elsewhere. His arrogance had made him sloppy, and Julia had exploited that weakness with precision. While he basked in the fleeting thrill of his newfound freedom, Julia coordinated with Vanessa to file for divorce, initiate legal actions to freeze their remaining assets, and prepare for an emergency court hearing. Every move was calculated, every step methodical. She didn't need to confront him with tears or pleas because her silence was louder than any argument. He thought he had escaped with everything, but in reality, he'd run straight into the snare she designed. Julia's revenge wasn't fueled by rage, it was crafted with the cold, steady hand of a woman who knew her worth and refused to be a casualty of someone else's midlife crisis. The tipping point had come long before his careless text. Julia could recall the exact moment her heart detached from him, not with anger, but with icy clarity. It was their anniversary, a date he'd clearly forgotten. She had prepared his favorite dinner, lit candles, and waited with a growing pit in her stomach as the clock ticked past midnight. No calls, no excuses, just silence. When he finally stumbled in, smelling faintly of a woman's perfume masked poorly by cheap cologne, he didn't even offer an apology. Instead, he grumbled about a long day at work and collapsed into bed without a second glance in her direction. That night, Julia lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the remnants of her love dissolve into nothingness. The next morning, she didn't confront him. She simply smiled, poured his coffee, and mentally filed the moment away under irreversible damage. It wasn't heartbreak, it was enlightenment. She realized she'd been holding on to the ghost of a marriage that had died long before. From that day, every smile she gave him was an act of performance, every kind word a rehearsed line. She became an actress in her own life, playing the role of the supportive wife while quietly preparing for the finale. He thought he was the one orchestrating their end, but Julia had already written the script. The final straw wasn't his betrayal, it was his underestimation. His arrogance in believing she would crumble without him, his condescension masked as concern, and his assumption that she'd be lost, drowning in regret. That was the true insult. Julia had built her life, her business, and her identity long before he came along, and she would continue to thrive long after he was gone. His infidelity was just the match, the real fire was her realization that she didn't need him and never had. She wasn't devastated. She was free. When Julia finally replied to his callous text with just 2 words, "Good luck," she knew it would gnaw at him far more than any angry tirade ever could. It was the perfect response, cold, indifferent, and dismissive. She imagined him staring at his phone, expecting a flood of desperate messages, accusations, or pleas. Instead, he was met with silence, a void where he had anticipated chaos. It wasn't that she didn't feel anything, it was that she refused to give him the satisfaction of witnessing it. Her emotions were neatly packed away, hidden behind the armor of self-control he never realized she possessed. In the days that followed, Julia maintained her routine as if nothing had changed. She managed her boutique, greeted customers with her usual warmth, and attended meetings with the same professionalism as always. Her staff noticed nothing different, and that was exactly how she wanted it. The world didn't need to see her pain, or, more accurately, her lack of it. The only difference was the quiet satisfaction that settled in her chest every time her phone buzzed with another desperate attempt from him to provoke a reaction. He went from smug to defensive to downright furious, his messages swinging wildly between insults and weak justifications. Julia didn't respond to any of them. Instead, she channeled her energy into preparation. Legal documents were signed, bank accounts secured, and every detail meticulously organized. She wasn't acting out of spite, she was reclaiming her narrative. The calmness she displayed wasn't a facade, it was the steady confidence of a woman who knew she had already won. While he spiraled, she thrived. And that was the sweetest revenge of all, not his downfall, but her indifference to it. Long before the final unraveling of her marriage, Julia had taken steps to secure her financial independence. It had started subtly, a small transfer here, a new account there, each move calculated and discreet. She didn't do it out of fear but out of foresight. She knew something was amiss, and she wasn't about to be blindsided. While he mocked her for being overly cautious with money, she built a fortress he'd never breach. Her boutique's profits had always been kept separate from their joint finances, a fact he dismissed as irrelevant, assuming his salary was the foundation of their lifestyle. The irony was delicious, her so-called hobby was what had safeguarded her future. The joint account he had so proudly drained contained nothing more than an illusion. Just enough to maintain appearances, to keep him from noticing the missing funds that had been quietly rerouted into secure investments and personal savings. Julia had watched as he celebrated his petty victory, unaware that he'd won an empty prize. His arrogance blinded him to the reality that she had outmaneuvered him at every turn. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. And Julia had never relinquished hers. She often thought about the irony of it all. The man who believed he held all the power was nothing more than a pawn in the game she had mastered. While he paraded his new relationship like a trophy, Julia smiled to herself, knowing that every step he took was on a path she had paved. His financial security, his future, even his sense of triumph, all of it built on a foundation she had already pulled out from under him. And when he finally realized it, when the facade crumbled, Julia wouldn't be there to witness his downfall. Because she didn't need to be. She had already moved on. Julia's phone rang late one evening as she was closing her boutique. The familiar number flashed on the screen, Vanessa, her lawyer, sharp as a blade and just as effective. "It's time," Vanessa said without preamble, her voice calm and precise. The divorce papers were ready, the evidence compiled, and the strategy set. Julia felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. This wasn't the beginning of a battle, it was the conclusion of one she'd already won. She didn't feel anxious or afraid. She felt empowered. They discussed the next steps, filing the paperwork, freezing the remaining joint assets, and scheduling an emergency court hearing. Vanessa's confidence was reassuring, but Julia had never doubted the outcome. She had prepared meticulously, gathering every shred of evidence with the precision of a surgeon. Text messages, bank statements, receipts, each piece a nail in the coffin of her husband's credibility. He thought he was leaving her in ruins, but he was about to discover that the real devastation was his own. As she hung up the phone, Julia allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The pieces were in place, and the game was almost over. She poured herself a glass of wine, sat by the window, and watched the city lights flicker in the distance. It was strange how quiet the world seemed when you knew you were about to change it. But Julia didn't feel the weight of that change. She felt light, free, and unburdened. Her husband had tried to break her, but all he'd done was set her free. And soon, he would realize just how costly that freedom was. Julia's plan unfolded with the elegance of a symphony, each note perfectly timed, each movement deliberate. She didn't need to lift her voice or engage in petty arguments. Instead, she let the legal process do the heavy lifting. Vanessa filed the divorce papers, accompanied by a motion to freeze any remaining joint assets. The documents detailed not just the financial betrayal but also his reckless abandonment, supported by screenshots of texts he never imagined would be used against him. His arrogance had been his greatest weakness, and Julia had weaponized it flawlessly. While he reveled in his new life with Melissa, oblivious to the storm brewing, Julia maintained her daily routine with quiet satisfaction. The boutique flourished, her customers none the wiser about the personal upheaval behind her poised smile. She found solace in the normalcy of her work, knowing that every transaction, every successful sale, was a testament to her independence, an independence he had underestimated. Julia didn't just survive, she thrived, each day a subtle victory against the man who thought he'd left her broken. As the court processed the paperwork, Julia's patience became her most powerful tool. She allowed him to bask in the illusion of triumph, to believe he had outsmarted her. His ignorance was the sweetest part of the setup. He had no idea that the foundation of his so-called victory was crumbling beneath him, meticulously eroded by the woman he thought was too weak to fight back. But Julia wasn't fighting. She was winning, quietly, elegantly, and with a grace he would never comprehend. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when Julia received an email alert from the credit card company, charges flagged as potential fraud. She knew immediately what it was, her husband's parting gift, as he had smugly referred to it in one of his texts. 2 first-class tickets to an exclusive Miami resort, booked on the joint credit card he assumed she was too distraught to monitor. The audacity would have been laughable if it weren't so predictable. Instead of reacting with anger, Julia picked up the phone and calmly dialed the credit card company's fraud department. "Hello, I'd like to report unauthorized charges," she said, her tone polite but firm. The representative's voice on the other end was professional, yet Julia could detect a subtle shift when she explained the situation. "I have text message evidence of my soon-to-be ex-husband admitting he used our joint card without my consent to fund a trip with his girlfriend." There was a pause, a slight intake of breath, before the representative responded, "We'll take care of this immediately, ma'am." And they did. Within minutes, the charges were reversed, the card canceled, and her husband removed as an authorized user. Julia could almost picture the scene, her husband and Melissa arriving at the airport, brimming with excitement, only to be told their tickets were invalid. The hotel reservation canceled, their plans unraveling in real time. She didn't need to witness his humiliation to savor it. The knowledge was enough. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. He had tried to use her one last time, to squeeze out whatever benefit he could before disappearing into his new life. But Julia had turned the tables, leaving him stranded, both literally and metaphorically. And she did it all with a single phone call. A few days after the credit card debacle, Julia received another message from her husband, dripping with entitlement. "Don't worry about the house. I'll let you stay there until you find something smaller." She laughed, actually laughed, reading it aloud in the quiet of her living room. The audacity was almost impressive. The house had never been his. It was a family heirloom, passed down from her grandmother, purchased long before she had even met him. His name wasn't on the deed, nor had he contributed a single cent to its mortgage or maintenance. Yet here he was, graciously allowing her to stay in her own home. Julia decided not to respond. His ignorance was self-inflicted, and she saw no reason to correct him. Instead, she forwarded the message to Vanessa, who replied with a succinct, "This will look great in court." She filed it away with the growing collection of evidence that painted him not just as a cheating spouse but as an arrogant fool oblivious to the legal realities of property ownership. The house was more than just a structure, it was a symbol of Julia's autonomy, a sanctuary built on her family's legacy, untouched by the man who now presumed to control it. As she walked through the familiar rooms, running her fingers along the worn banister her grandfather had polished decades ago, Julia felt a profound sense of peace. This was her space, her history, her life. No man's betrayal could taint it. The house stood as a testament to her resilience, a physical embodiment of roots deeper and stronger than any fleeting marriage. While he scrambled to rebuild his life from the ruins of his own making, Julia stood firm, anchored not by bitterness but by the unshakable foundation he never understood. The house wasn't just hers on paper, it was hers in spirit, an inheritance of strength he could never claim. The boutique had always been Julia's pride, but in the aftermath of her husband's betrayal, it became her sanctuary, a living testament to her resilience and independence. Nestled on a bustling street lined with chic cafes and artisan shops, it flourished under her meticulous care. While he dismissed it as her little shop, it was, in reality, a thriving business that provided not only financial stability but also a deep sense of purpose. Each sale, each satisfied customer, was a reminder that her success had never depended on him. She built this from the ground up, fueled by passion, creativity, and an unwavering work ethic. The irony wasn't lost on Julia. While her husband floundered, trying to establish a new life funded by dwindling resources, she thrived. The boutique's profits had been carefully shielded from their joint finances, a decision he once mocked as overly cautious. But that caution had become her safeguard. The shelves gleamed with curated collections, the air filled with the soft hum of content customers and the subtle scent of luxury candles. It was more than a business, it was her empire, crafted with love and fortified by lessons learned from betrayal. One afternoon, as she arranged a new window display, her phone buzzed with another message from him, laced with condescension and thinly veiled bitterness. "I hope your little shop is keeping you busy." Julia smiled, her reflection in the glass radiating the quiet confidence he never appreciated. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her boutique was her answer, a thriving testament to the life she had built without him. Each sale, each new customer, was a silent victory, a reminder that while he tried to diminish her, she had only grown stronger. He had left her, believing she would crumble. Instead, she flourished, surrounded by the success he never saw coming. The unraveling of her husband's life wasn't confined to canceled credit cards and frozen assets, it seeped into the very fabric of his family dynamics. Julia had always maintained a cordial relationship with his relatives, navigating the usual tensions with grace. But betrayal has a way of magnifying fault lines, and soon the cracks in his carefully curated facade began to show. His mother, Barbara, called one afternoon, her voice dripping with passive-aggressive concern. "Mark told us everything, dear. He says you've been quite difficult, causing unnecessary drama." Julia almost laughed but chose restraint instead. "Barbara," she replied evenly, "did he mention emptying our joint account and using our credit card for his little vacation with Melissa?" The silence on the other end was deafening. Julia could almost hear the mental calculations, the slow unraveling of the narrative he'd spun. When Barbara finally spoke, her tone was less certain, laced with confusion. "Well, he said things weren't working, that you were distant." Julia didn't bother to explain further. She didn't need validation from people who were quick to believe half-truths without questioning the source. Word spread quickly through their social circles, fueled by whispers and speculation. Mutual friends, once charmed by her husband's charisma, began to distance themselves as the full story emerged. Julia didn't engage in gossip. She let the facts speak for themselves. Screenshots, legal filings, canceled reservations, each piece of evidence painting a picture far more damning than any rumor could. Her silence was her strength, and as his world crumbled, she remained an unshakable force, untouched by the chaos he had created. His family's judgment had once mattered to her. Now, their opinions were as irrelevant as the man who betrayed her. It wasn't long before the details of Julia's crumbling marriage spilled into the digital world. Social media, once a casual scroll of vacation photos and birthday wishes, transformed into a battlefield where passive-aggressive posts and veiled jabs told stories louder than words. Julia had remained silent, refraining from airing personal grievances publicly, but her husband and his new flame, Melissa, couldn't resist the urge to overshare. Their Instagram feeds were flooded with curated snapshots of beach getaways, expensive dinners, and captions dripping with faux happiness, living our best life. As if hashtags could mask the underlying cracks. But reality doesn't filter as easily as a photo. Comments began to shift from praise to curiosity, then thinly veiled judgment. Mutual friends noticed the timeline didn't align with his claims of a clean break. Questions popped up in comment sections. "Didn't you just celebrate an anniversary with Julia last month?" Until the carefully constructed illusion began to crumble. Julia watched from afar, sipping her morning coffee with quiet amusement as Melissa's posts grew more defensive, her smile stretched thinner in each new picture. The desperate need to project perfection was, ironically, what exposed their flaws. The final blow came when Melissa, in a fit of frustration, posted a lengthy rant disguised as a motivational quote about toxic exes and ungrateful people who can't move on. Screenshots of the post circulated like wildfire, dissected and discussed in hushed tones among their shared circles. Julia never commented, never liked, never reacted. Her silence was louder than any public outburst. While they unraveled online, desperate for attention and validation, Julia flourished quietly in the background, her dignity intact. She didn't need to defend herself. The truth had a way of surfacing all on its own, and when it did, it was far more satisfying than any carefully crafted caption. The court order arrived on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning, a crisp, official envelope nestled among mundane bills and catalogs. Julia opened it with practiced indifference, her heart steady as she read the judge's decision, a temporary freeze on all joint assets, pending the final divorce settlement. It was a formality, really, but the implications were profound. Her husband, who had so confidently drained their account and flaunted his financial freedom, was now legally paralyzed. His credit cards would decline. His access to shared investments gone. The empire he thought he controlled had been iced over, as brittle and fragile as his ego. Julia imagined the scene, him at some overpriced cafe, attempting to pay for brunch with Melissa, only to have the transaction declined. The flush of embarrassment creeping up his neck, the forced laugh as he fumbled for excuses. She didn't relish his humiliation out of spite, it was the poetic justice of it all that satisfied her. For years, he had operated under the illusion that control equated to power, that money was his ultimate leverage. But Julia had rewritten the rules, using the very systems he ignored to dismantle his sense of security. The same man who once belittled her attention to detail was now undone by it. Back at home, Julia filed the court order neatly into her binder, alongside other legal documents chronicling the demise of her marriage. She felt no pang of nostalgia, no flicker of regret. Her heart, once tender and vulnerable, had grown resilient, fortified by betrayal and reclaimed autonomy. The freezing of assets mirrored the emotional freeze she'd undergone, no longer attached to the man who believed he'd broken her. If anything, he had set her free. The irony was almost too perfect. He was frozen, financially and emotionally adrift, while she moved forward, unbound and unapologetically whole. The unraveling of her husband's facade wasn't confined to legal documents and frozen bank accounts, it bled into the very social circles where he once thrived. What began as whispered speculations among friends soon escalated into open conversations at dinner parties, work functions, and casual meetups. His downfall became the unspoken headline in every room he entered. Julia didn't have to say a word, the evidence spoke for itself. The canceled credit cards, the frozen assets, the crumbling image of a man who thought he was untouchable, it all painted a picture more vivid than any rumor. At one particularly ironic event, a charity gala he'd once insisted Julia attend to support his network, he arrived with Melissa on his arm, desperate to maintain appearances. But the whispers followed them like shadows. Julia heard about it later from mutual acquaintances, describing how his charm seemed forced, his laughter hollow. The attendees, once enamored by his confident demeanor, now saw through the veneer. The same people who once praised his ambition now questioned his integrity. It wasn't just about the affair, it was the arrogance, the blatant disregard for those he'd wronged, that soured his reputation. Meanwhile, Julia's absence at such events only amplified her presence. People speculated, admired, even sympathized, but most importantly, they respected her for the grace with which she handled the scandal. She never retaliated publicly, never fed the gossip mill. Her strength lay in her restraint, a quiet dignity that contrasted sharply with his desperate need for validation. In the court of public opinion, she had already won. His humiliation wasn't a victory she sought, but it was a natural consequence of his actions. While he struggled to salvage his image, Julia's reputation remained untarnished, a testament to the power of silent resilience. As the novelty of their affair faded, reality crept into the cracks of her husband's new relationship. Melissa, once basking in the thrill of stolen moments and secret rendezvous, found herself tethered to a man unraveling before her eyes. The charm that once captivated her grew stale, replaced by bitterness and financial strain. The lavish dinners dwindled, spontaneous trips became logistical nightmares, and the weight of unpaid bills replaced the excitement of forbidden romance. What Melissa had mistaken for love was nothing more than an illusion, propped up by stolen resources and fragile ego. Julia heard about their struggles through the grapevine, snippets of conversations from mutual acquaintances who relished the dramatic downfall. Melissa's social media, once a highlight reel of extravagant escapades, became eerily silent. No more sunset selfies or champagne toasts, just carefully curated photos, devoid of the spark that once fueled their narrative. Julia didn't gloat, she observed. It was a masterclass in consequences, watching two people who built their relationship on deceit struggle under the weight of their own choices. The final confirmation of Melissa's regret came unexpectedly, a poorly thought-out message sent to Julia's boutique's business email. "I never meant to hurt you. Things aren't what I thought they'd be." Julia stared at the screen, her expression unreadable. She didn't reply. There was nothing to say. Melissa's regret was hers to carry, a consequence of decisions made without foresight. Julia had no interest in her apologies or explanations. Closure wasn't necessary when you'd already moved on. The message was just another artifact in the archive of a life she no longer belonged to, a relic of mistakes she never made. Julia's quiet strength had garnered silent admirers, some of whom she never expected. One afternoon, as she organized new inventory in her boutique, she received an unexpected visitor, an old acquaintance, Daniel, a former colleague of her husband. His presence was surprising, but his demeanor was warm, genuine. "I just wanted to say," he began, shifting uncomfortably, "I always admired how you handled things. And I thought you should know. Mark wasn't just careless with your marriage. He's been reckless in business, too." Julia listened, her curiosity piqued. Daniel revealed details about financial misconduct Julia hadn't known, misappropriated funds, unethical deals, all hidden behind the same charm and arrogance her husband wielded in their personal life. It wasn't just a failing marriage, it was a crumbling empire, built on fragile lies and short-sighted decisions. Julia felt a mix of emotions, not anger, but validation. Her instincts had been right all along, not just about his infidelity but about the very fabric of his character. Daniel's information wasn't just gossip, it was leverage, another piece of the puzzle that painted a fuller picture of the man she'd left behind. Grateful but composed, Julia thanked Daniel, her mind already strategizing. She didn't need revenge, she needed closure, and sometimes, information was the most powerful tool. Armed with new insights, she met with Vanessa to discuss the legal implications. Every revelation tightened her case, not out of spite, but out of principle. This wasn't just about winning a divorce settlement, it was about reclaiming her narrative. The unexpected ally had unknowingly given her the final piece she needed to close this chapter for good. Julia didn't need to destroy her husband's life. He'd done that all by himself. She just ensured the truth was undeniable. While her husband scrambled to salvage what little dignity remained, Julia mastered the art of silence, a weapon far more powerful than any confrontation. She never engaged in petty arguments, never responded to his desperate attempts to provoke her. His emails grew increasingly erratic, swinging between defensive justifications and bitter accusations. "You've turned everyone against me," one message read, dripping with the frustration of a man realizing he was no longer in control. But Julia never replied. She knew that silence, when wielded correctly, echoes louder than words. Her refusal to engage left him unraveling on his own. He wanted a reaction, anger, tears, even rage, but she gave him nothing. No emotional currency to fuel his ego, no validation of his importance. While he stewed in the emptiness of unanswered messages, Julia's life thrived in peaceful routine. She poured her energy into her boutique, her friendships, and her own well-being. The satisfaction didn't come from his downfall, it came from knowing she no longer cared. His relevance had evaporated the moment she realized her life was better without him. People often mistook silence for weakness, but Julia understood it was the ultimate form of control. Words could be twisted, emotions exploited, but silence? It was untouchable. It left space for reflection, for dignity, and most importantly, for growth. She didn't need to scream to prove she was strong. She simply lived her life unapologetically, her quiet confidence speaking volumes. And that, more than any harsh word or courtroom victory, was what truly broke him, the realization that she had moved on so completely, he was nothing more than an echo in the background of her life. The day of the final court hearing arrived with little fanfare. Julia dressed in a simple, elegant suit, her demeanor calm and composed. The courthouse buzzed with hushed voices and hurried footsteps, but she felt detached from the chaos, as if observing from a distance. Her husband arrived late, flustered and noticeably thinner, his arrogance dimmed by the weight of impending consequences. He barely met her gaze, the confidence that once defined him now replaced by visible insecurity. Julia didn't flinch. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough. Inside the courtroom, the proceedings unfolded with clinical precision. Vanessa presented the evidence meticulously: financial records, incriminating texts, testimonies from former colleagues like Daniel. Julia's husband attempted to defend himself, his arguments riddled with contradictions and thinly veiled bitterness. He spoke of betrayal, painting himself as the victim, but the facts stood in stark contrast to his narrative. Julia remained silent throughout, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to defend herself, the truth was her greatest advocate. When the judge delivered the verdict, the words felt both heavy and liberating. Julia was granted full ownership of the house, a significant portion of their remaining assets, and legal acknowledgement of her husband's misconduct. He sat there, stunned, as if the reality of his actions had only just dawned on him. Julia didn't gloat. She simply gathered her things, thanked Vanessa, and walked out of the courtroom with the same grace she'd carried throughout the entire ordeal. The victory wasn't in the legal win, it was in her unshaken dignity, her ability to face betrayal without losing herself. And as she stepped into the sunlight, she felt lighter, as if the weight of his shadow had finally lifted. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive, a reflection of the undeniable evidence stacked against Julia's husband. As the verdict echoed through the courtroom, Julia sat poised, her face serene, betraying none of the emotions swirling beneath the surface. The court awarded her not only the house but also substantial financial compensation, including a portion of her husband's hidden assets that Vanessa had skillfully unearthed. His attempt to outmaneuver her had not only failed but backfired spectacularly. He slumped in his seat, disbelief etched across his face, while Julia remained composed, her silence a stark contrast to his unraveling. But beyond the legal jargon and asset division, the true weight of the verdict lay in its symbolic meaning. It wasn't just about property or money, it was a formal acknowledgement of her husband's betrayal and her resilience. The courtroom, once an arena of potential confrontation, had become a stage where Julia's quiet strength shone the brightest. She didn't need dramatic outbursts or impassioned speeches. Her meticulous preparation, unwavering composure, and silent dignity spoke louder than any argument he could muster. As the session adjourned, Julia stood, gathering her documents with steady hands. She glanced briefly at her husband, not with anger or triumph, but with indifference. He was just a chapter in her story, a lesson, not a loss. Walking out of the courtroom, she felt an overwhelming sense of closure. The legal battle was over, but more importantly, so was the emotional one. She had won, not just in court, but in life, reclaiming her narrative from the ashes of betrayal. And that victory, carved out of grace and perseverance, was hers alone. Weeks after the court ruling, Julia received one final message from her ex-husband. The notification flashed briefly on her phone, a name that once triggered heartache now met with nothing more than mild curiosity. The message was a jumbled mix of regret and bitterness. "I hope you're happy. You ruined everything." Julia stared at the screen for a moment, considering whether to respond. She didn't feel the rush of anger she might have once expected. Instead, she felt nothing. It was as if the words belonged to a stranger, irrelevant and powerless. With a faint smile, she typed her response, "Good luck." The same words she had sent the day he announced their divorce, now bookending their story with perfect symmetry. It wasn't petty or vindictive, it was closure. Two simple words that carried the weight of everything left unsaid. She imagined him reading it, the realization sinking in that she had never been the one who lost. She had simply let go, while he remained trapped in the consequences of his own choices. Julia put her phone down, not giving the message another thought. She didn't need to revisit the past, it had served its purpose. The final message wasn't just for him, it was for herself. A reminder that she had navigated betrayal, heartache, and humiliation with grace. She had risen from it all, not as a victim, but as a woman who refused to be defined by someone else's mistakes. And in that quiet, unassuming reply, she found the peace she never thought she needed. With the legal battles behind her, Julia embraced the blank canvas of her new life with a quiet excitement. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic reinventions, just small, deliberate steps toward rediscovering herself. She poured fresh energy into her boutique, expanding its reach and introducing new collections that reflected her personal growth. Each day felt lighter, unburdened by the shadows of the past. The spaces once filled with memories of her marriage were now reclaimed, infused with her own identity, untouched by the remnants of betrayal. She began exploring hobbies she had long set aside: photography, weekend hikes, spontaneous road trips. Life felt fuller, not because of any external change, but because she had reclaimed the emotional space once occupied by heartache. Relationships deepened with friends who had stood by her, offering laughter and warmth where once there had been tension. Julia found herself smiling more, not the polite smiles she'd mastered during her marriage, but genuine, effortless expressions of joy. One evening, as she stood on her balcony watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, she felt a profound sense of contentment. She had navigated the storm and emerged not just unscathed, but stronger, more authentic. The past was no longer a weight but a chapter, a necessary part of her story, but not the whole book. This was her new beginning, not defined by what she had lost, but by what she had gained: freedom, resilience, and an unwavering sense of self. Rebuilding her life wasn't about starting over, it was about building differently, with intention and clarity. Julia approached this new chapter with the same meticulous care she had once reserved for her boutique. She invested not just in her business, but in herself. Therapy sessions became a space for reflection, not healing from heartbreak, but understanding her own growth. She wasn't just recovering from a failed marriage, she was evolving into a version of herself she'd never fully known. She renovated her home, stripping away remnants of the past. Each change, from fresh paint to new furniture, felt symbolic, a physical manifestation of her emotional transformation. The house wasn't just hers legally, it was hers emotionally, every corner reflecting her taste, her choices, her independence. She traveled, exploring places she dreamed of but never prioritized. Standing alone on foreign streets, she felt empowered, unafraid of solitude because she had discovered that her own company was enough. Through it all, Julia realized that strength wasn't about avoiding pain, it was about facing it, learning from it, and growing despite it. She didn't just rebuild, she redefined. Life was no longer a series of obligations tied to someone else's expectations. It was a canvas she painted with bold, unapologetic strokes. The woman who once doubted her worth had been replaced by someone who knew exactly who she was: resilient, fearless, and whole. Julia wasn't looking for love. She wasn't even looking for companionship. But life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, a chance meeting at a local cafe with Ethan, an architect whose warmth was as effortless as his charm. Their conversation began over a shared compliment about the cafe's design and flowed naturally, like two rivers merging without force. There were no grand declarations, no whirlwind romance, just simple, genuine connection. What made Ethan different wasn't grand gestures or empty promises. It was the way he listened, the way he valued her thoughts, the way he admired her independence without feeling threatened by it. Julia felt none of the anxieties that had plagued her past relationships. There was no need to perform, to shrink, or to compromise parts of herself. With Ethan, she was just Julia, unfiltered, unapologetic, and deeply seen. Their relationship unfolded slowly, naturally, rooted in mutual respect and shared values. It wasn't about filling a void because Julia had none. She wasn't looking for someone to complete her, she was already whole. Ethan simply complemented the life she had built, adding warmth without overshadowing her light. And in that simplicity, Julia discovered a love that wasn't about rescue or validation. It was about partnership, two strong individuals choosing to walk side by side, not out of necessity, but out of genuine desire. While Julia thrived in her newfound independence, her ex-husband's life unraveled with the inevitability of a poorly constructed facade collapsing under its own weight. The financial security he had taken for granted evaporated as legal fees, unpaid debts, and the absence of Julia's silent support began to suffocate him. The job he once bragged about lost its shine when whispers of his unethical behavior reached the ears of his superiors. His charm, once an asset in boardrooms and social circles, now rang hollow, tainted by the reputation he'd so carelessly tarnished. Melissa, too, grew disillusioned. The thrill of an affair had faded, replaced by the harsh realities of bills, legal battles, and a man whose charisma crumbled under pressure. Their once envied relationship deteriorated into petty arguments and resentments, each blaming the other for their downfall. The lavish dinners and spontaneous vacations gave way to awkward silences and financial strain. Eventually, Melissa left, taking with her the final illusion of happiness he had clung to. Alone, he faced the consequences of his choices, surrounded not by admiration but by the echoes of bridges burned and relationships squandered. Julia heard about his decline through mutual acquaintances and social whispers, though she never sought out the information. It found her naturally, carried by those who once idolized him but now shared his failures with morbid fascination. She felt no joy in his downfall, only a detached acknowledgement of the inevitable. His life fell apart not because she sought revenge, but because he had built it on deception, arrogance, and the false belief that actions bear no consequences. Julia didn't need to witness his suffering to feel vindicated. His emptiness was the legacy of his own making, and that was enough. Fate has a curious way of orchestrating encounters we never anticipate. Julia was at a cafe, tucked into a cozy corner with a cup of tea and her laptop, reviewing new designs for her boutique's winter collection. The door chimed, and without looking up, she continued typing until a familiar voice, strained and unfamiliar in its fragility, broke through the background noise. She glanced up and there he was, her ex-husband, thinner, wearier, his once confident posture now hunched under the invisible weight of his own regrets. Their eyes met briefly, an electric jolt of recognition passing between them. He hesitated, clearly debating whether to approach, but his ego, or perhaps a flicker of unresolved guilt, propelled him forward. "Julia," he greeted her, his voice lacking the arrogance she remembered, replaced by a brittle, hollow tone. She closed her laptop slowly, giving him a polite, indifferent smile. "Hello," she replied simply, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the nervous energy radiating from him. There was no anger, no bitterness, just a quiet strength that unsettled him more than any harsh words could have. He fumbled through small talk, his words stumbling over half-hearted apologies and vague regrets. Julia listened, not because she cared about his explanations, but because she realized how far she had come. The man who once held power over her emotions now stood as a shadow of himself, seeking validation she no longer needed to give. When he finally trailed off, she stood, gathering her things. "Take care," she said softly, her voice steady, her heart unshaken. She walked away without looking back, leaving him standing there amidst the remnants of a life he had destroyed on his own. And in that moment, Julia knew she had truly moved on. Weeks after their brief encounter, Julia received a handwritten letter, an unexpected relic in an age of digital communication. The handwriting was unmistakably his, shaky and less confident than she remembered. She debated whether to open it, curiosity battling with indifference, but eventually unfolded the paper with clinical detachment. The words inside were a mixture of apology and regret, lines filled with acknowledgement of his mistakes, his failures, and his inability to appreciate what he had until it was gone. "I see now how much I took for granted. I was blind to your strength, your value. I'm sorry." Julia read the letter once, then set it down, her emotions untouched by the sentimentality he tried to evoke. The apology, though perhaps genuine, was too late to matter. It wasn't that she harbored resentment, there was simply nothing left to forgive. The person she had been during their marriage no longer existed, replaced by someone who had grown beyond the need for his validation. She didn't feel satisfaction or closure because she had already found both long before he put pen to paper. She placed the letter in a drawer, not out of sentiment, but as a reminder, a symbol of how far she'd come. His words were a reflection of his journey, not hers. Julia had already written her own story, one that didn't require his remorse to feel complete. His apology was a whisper in a life now filled with the roar of her own achievements, her own happiness. She smiled softly, not for him, but for herself, knowing that true healing had never depended on the words he finally managed to say. Revenge is often painted as grand gestures of retaliation, dramatic confrontations, or poetic justice. But Julia discovered the ultimate form of revenge wasn't rooted in anger or vindication, it was indifference. True power came from the absence of emotion, the realization that someone who once dominated her thoughts now held no space in her heart. His downfall, his regrets, even his belated apology, all of it was insignificant against the vast landscape of her new life. He was just a footnote in her story, a lesson learned, not a scar to be carried. Julia's days were filled with purpose and joy, untouched by the echoes of the past. Her boutique flourished, her friendships deepened, and her heart remained open, not scarred, but seasoned with wisdom. She passed by familiar places without the sting of old memories, felt no pang when hearing his name in passing. The life they shared had faded into the background, overshadowed by the richness of her present. His existence no longer defined her narrative, it was simply a chapter she had long since turned. The beauty of indifference lay in its simplicity. There was no need to prove anything, no desire to gloat or seek acknowledgement. Julia's success was its own testament, not a product of revenge, but of resilience. She had not only survived betrayal, she had transcended it. And while he grappled with the consequences of his choices, she thrived in the quiet, powerful freedom of not caring at all. That, she realized, was the greatest victory of all, not that he regretted losing her, but that she no longer needed him to. Standing on the balcony of her apartment, overlooking the city lights flickering like distant stars, Julia reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the legal battles, they were all chapters in a story that wasn't about loss, but growth. Life had taught her that strength wasn't found in avoiding pain, but in facing it head-on, allowing it to shape, not shatter. She had learned that self-worth doesn't come from being loved by someone else, but from loving yourself enough to walk away when you're no longer valued. The lessons were woven into the fabric of her days, in the confidence with which she managed her business, in the laughter shared with friends, in the quiet moments of solitude that no longer felt lonely. She had discovered resilience in the ashes of disappointment, hope in the aftermath of endings, and most importantly, a profound sense of peace in letting go. Her life was no longer defined by the roles she played, wife, partner, victim, but by the person she had become, independent, fearless, and whole. As the cool evening breeze brushed against her skin, Julia smiled, not for the past, not for what was lost, but for everything she had gained. The story wasn't about revenge or even redemption. It was about transformation. About finding light after darkness, strength after weakness, and love, not from others, but from within. She had walked through fire and emerged not burnt, but forged anew. And that, she realized, was the true lesson. Life isn't about avoiding the storms, but learning how to dance in the rain.